Support for Headline Humboldt is made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Coming up next on Headline Humboldt, the county gets a $44 million grant to build a new and much-needed psychiatric facility in Eureka. Also, we interview award-winning journalist Liam Scott from Voice of America on the state of journalism in the age of Trump and how democracies need truth to thrive. Coming up now on Headline Humboldt. From the top of Humboldt Hill, this is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Over the past several decades, we've witnessed the slow and seemingly inexorable decline of public discourse in this country and in the world. First, there was a blatant and organized effort on the part of some partisans in the U.S. to establish and maintain an infrastructure for the dissemination of a party line. In the 1990s, this first manifested as the talk radio phenomenon, with personalities like Rush Limbaugh and Michael Savage channeling the rage of right-wing ideologues and disaffected white communities into a powerful political machine. The success of that movement caught the attention of political operatives and some media giants who diverted that energy into the creation of organizations like Fox News and other outlets, thereby perfecting a system of delivering biased news and manufacturing opinion. This was the weapon used so effectively against the presidency of Barack Obama. That right-wing zeitgeist was soon accompanied by the explosion of social media sites like Twitter and Facebook, who perfected the arts of influence and micro-targeting and have since allowed for the slow and continued degradation of news reporting in this country. By so effectively isolating people into their own personal information bubbles, such sites have accelerated political division and caused rampant radicalization. They've also contributed to the subjectification of truth and the shattering of communal standards in journalism and politics. We've since ended up in a dark place with an emboldened and undemocratic president who is actively working to undermine independence in media and punish those outlets who refuse to play along. What does this mean for our democracy? Can we survive the death of truth? We'll speak with award-winning Voice of America journalist Liam Scott in just a moment to explore that question and others. But first, the news. As reported by Cal Matters, Governor Gavin Newsom has reversed course and is now proposing to freeze the enrollment of undocumented immigrants into Medi-Cal and charge premiums. The move is expected to save the state more than $5 billion. Under Newsom's proposal announced this week, Medi-Cal, the state's health insurance program for low-income people and those with disabilities, beginning in 2026, would no longer accept new enrollees 19 and older who lack permanent legal status. The 1.6 million immigrants already signed up would not lose their Medi-Cal coverage, and children could still enroll. All undocumented Californians would still be covered for emergency medical and pregnancy care, so-called limited scope coverage that is paid for with federal dollars. But those who don't enroll before January of 2026 would be uncovered for other medical expenses, such as prescription drugs and doctor visits. Before the changes can go into effect, the California legislature will have to approve them in the state budget. Democratic lawmakers have so far largely balked at making major cuts to Medi-Cal coverage for immigrants. State Senator Scott Wiener, a San Francisco Democrat and chair of the Senate Budget Committee, said at a luncheon last month that despite fiscal uncertainty, Senate Democrats want to ensure health care coverage for immigrants in California. Humboldt County has been awarded a $43.5 million grant to build a psychiatric facility in downtown Eureka. It will be the new Semper Virens facility. The funding comes through Proposition 1. Prop 1, the Behavioral Health Services Act, was passed by California voters in March of 2024 and replaces the Mental Health Services Act of 2004. It reforms behavioral health care funding to prioritize services for people with the most significant mental health needs while adding the treatment of substance use disorders, expanding housing interventions, and increasing the behavioral health workforce. The new ADA accessible facility, which will be housed on 5th Street across the street from the Humboldt County Courthouse, will be more than 21,000 square feet, include 16 psychiatric health care facility beds and 4 crisis stabilization unit beds, and will make it possible to expand access to children and youth, as well as patients who are not ambulatory. DHHS Director Connie Beck said, quote, "This new facility will make it possible for us to provide crisis stabilization and improved trauma-informed intensive care in patient services for individuals living with serious and/or severe mental or behavioral health conditions in a more therapeutic environment than the current facility. We'll be right back after this short break.
KEET PBS invites you to feel the funk. Join us Saturday, May 17th at 7 p.m. at the Arcada Playhouse for a free screening of We Want the Funk, a powerful new documentary from Emmy winner Stanley Nelson and Grammy-nominated co-director Nicole London. The film traces the vibrant history of funk music and its role in cultural change. Then get on your feet for a live concert with Claire Bent and Citizen Funk. It's a night of film, music, and community you won't forget. Register now at keet.org.
Here is my conversation with award-winning Voice of America journalist Liam Scott on the media's challenge in this political moment.
I'm a journalist based in Washington, D.C. For the past few years, I reported on press freedom issues at Voice of America, so both U.S. press freedom issues and also international press freedom issues. I did that for a few years up until mid-March when the Trump administration moved to got Voice of America. I was placed on administrative leave alongside about 1,300 of my colleagues. In the meantime, since I've been sidelined from reporting, I've been freelancing, still covering these issues, the intersection of media and democracy. I also write a newsletter called the Press Freedom Report that focuses on these issues as well.
I work at PBS. We're a PBS station, so we're experiencing some of the same crunch that you went through with Voice of America, where our funding has been threatened and Trump has identified PBS and NPR as sources of, the kind of news that he doesn't appreciate, which I guess that's his prerogative, or we'll see. That's being weighed in the courts right now. When you talk about democracy and press freedoms, what kind of issues came up as part of your beat with Voice of America? And what are some of the more prevalent issues facing, journalists in an international market or coverage kind of thing?
Absolutely. One thing that really comes to mind that I reported on a lot around the world is this issue of lawfare, which is when often governments use and abuse the law to target journalists, usually in retaliation for their reporting. And it's often under the guise of, crimes, alleged crimes that have nothing to do with their reporting at all, like money laundering, like tax evasion, like smuggling foreign currency, things like that, that have nothing to do with their reporting on the surface, but are really in retaliation for their reporting. So it's this use and abuse of the law that you're really seeing to target journalists. That's an issue that has really become more pervasive around the world. And it's also something that I would argue that we're kind of seeing more in the United States now in terms of, especially, President Trump is no stranger to filing lawsuits against news organizations, for instance. There's the ongoing one against CBS News. There's the ongoing one against the Des Moines Register. So it's something that we might be seeing, that we have been seeing in the United States as well.
Given that that's a way that more authoritarian regimes try to counteract critical coverage, what's the risk? Both as you've seen played out in other countries and here, if journalists feel like they can be targeted by power structures simply for reporting the facts.
What's important when it comes to these kinds of lawsuits is that regardless of whether you're in a place where rule of law exists, oftentimes the point behind these lawsuits is that they can be used to discredit the news organization so that audiences might, question whether they should trust this news outlet anymore. They can also be used to put financial strain on news outlets that can make it more difficult for them to continue operating because, paying for lawyers, going through, court battles can be expensive. So those are two of the main things that, even if these lawsuits are bogus, they can still serve to silence or discredit news outlets through those different ways.
They're expensive. So no matter what, it functions as a kind of fine for a news organization for being critical. It's interesting. We've seen this kind of. I don't know. There's been an evolution over the past probably 3 decades where news organizations got increasingly, not even news organizations, the information sphere sort of got increasingly partisan. And you wrote about in your column for Poynter about the fairness doctrine and how its revocation led to the kind of the explosion of the talk radio phenomenon in the 90s. And I would argue that the talk radio phenomenon led to Fox News, and it was sort of this exploding evolution of right-wing organizations who were basically manipulating opinion through their unfair coverage. Do you see that same thing happening, and do you make those connections? And is there anything that we can do that respects the press freedoms while still trying to correct for this swerve that's happened?
That's a really interesting question, and it's a tough question. Because you're right, the repeal of the fairness doctrine, of course, really did contribute to the media landscape that we're operating in now. I mean, it's always a question of would we have arrived at this landscape anyway with the advent of, Spotify, places, streaming services like that? Would we have already come here? Did the repeal of the fairness doctrine just accelerate the landscape that we were already headed towards? There have been
The fairness doctrine was a rule that basically said broadcasters had to cover both sides of a controversial issue, right?
Yes, exactly. So they had to, provide balanced coverage of controversial issues. But what's interesting also, what I learned in my reporting on the history of the fairness doctrine is that sometimes outlets were, wary of covering those controversial issues at all because they were worried that they would be they might not do it the right way. They might be targeted, get lawsuits. So in some ways, it stifled reporting as well because they were worried they wouldn't, they were worried of potentially violating the fairness doctrine. So they just didn't cover those issues at all, which is something that I didn't expect to learn in my reporting, but was something that also happened as well. There have been various attempts over the years to bring back the fairness doctrine or some version of the fairness doctrine, but that hasn't been successful. I can't say if that, it's not my place to, kind of hypothesize as to whether that, it could come back one day. But it is a very, I don't think, I'm sorry, I don't know if I have an answer on kind of how we, recognizing how polarized the media environment is right now, how do we, respond to that? But I think it's beyond the fairness doctrine.
Absolutely. When you spent years working for Voice of America and covering areas outside of the U.S. as well as the U.S. When there is that kind of polarization and that kind of manipulation of the, the public conversation, what kind of problems arise out of that? And where does, how toxic can that be ultimately for democratic systems?
Yeah, what Voice of America is, for those who don't know, its mission is to broadcast to censored populations around the world. That's VOA's mission. It's the mission of, long been the mission of its sister outlets like Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, to broadcast independent, fair, balanced news to populations around the world where that doesn't exist oftentimes because the governments in those respective countries repress and crack down on domestic independent media. And what often happens is kind of seeing, Voice of America and its sister outlets, which provides, has historically provided independent, unbiased, fact-based news to places where maybe the other main option is state-backed disinformation, state-backed media propaganda that is not, maybe does not represent a plurality of views, that is not necessarily, accurate or balanced. So I think that has given me a really good perspective and appreciation, I guess, for, the historic role that VOA has played around the world. I mean, it's reached over 300 million people per week in some of the most censored places around the world. So it's, unfortunate that has face the barriers that it's facing now from the administration. I'm not sure if this is answering your question.
Basically I'm asking, like, what are the downstream effects of, like, if you're operating in an area and you're providing balanced coverage and you're trying to get some light into a place that's, rather in a kind of a dark place, informationally, what happens? What's the risk when that disappears?
Oh,
Any
okay.
thoughts? Yeah, what are
I
the downstream
understand.
effects from that? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think having access to accurate information in the United States and anywhere in the world is absolutely crucial for being able to make decisions in your daily life. And in some situations, those can be life or death decisions. I think of, I've done a lot of reporting on Myanmar, for instance, which it has been, really engulfed in civil war for the past few years since the coup in 2021. And having access, people in Myanmar on the ground in Myanmar need to have access to information as to, is this part of the country safe? Can I go to, is this road clear? Where is the military, engaging in airstrikes right now? Those are really important, that's really important information that people need to have access to, make life or death decisions in their daily lives. And if they don't have access to that information, that can pose a really big issue. In the United States, I did. I think this was I think it was in Pointer or for a story that I did in another news outlet recently. That people need to have access to information on food safety in the United States. If there's a measles outbreak in a local community, having access to that information is absolutely crucial for making decisions in your daily lives. And if you don't have access to that information, it can pose really big issues to people. It can have really big ramifications in their lives. And the important thing is that when journalists are targeted, you're targeting the journalist, but you're targeting the message, you're targeting the information that they're trying to deliver to their audiences. So it has really big, targeting journalists has really big implications for the public as well.
One of the most recent articles that you wrote was about student journalists and the trial by fire. Can you sort of summarize what you were covering in that story and what kind of challenges student journalists are facing in an era when their colleges, are also under the gun?
Absolutely. Student journalism, student journalists have always done real journalism, but it's typically been also been considered a training ground of sorts to really learn how to do reporting. But over the past few months, student journalists across the country have really been on the front lines of some of the biggest news stories in the country as the Trump administration works to, cut federal grants to universities and also as immigration officials to detain students. So they've been covering these huge stories happening on their campuses, and they've been really contending with really big questions over things like source and author anonymity, over journalist safety, online harassment, and really the broader question of the role of student journalism in Trump's America. And I spoke with a lot of student journalists at a variety of institutions across the country, public universities, private universities, different, geographic regions. And of course, their experiences vary, but one of the through lines that I saw is this real sense that they're under this extreme pressure. As a couple students put it, was a trial by fire, what they're going through right now. That they're under this extreme pressure, they have this immense responsibility as well, though, and they feel this immense responsibility and this duty to really, meet the moment and rise to the challenge and do this reporting that, yes, national outlets are covering as well, but they have a really unique perspective into the minds of fellow students who are going through this right now alongside them.
We talk about balance, and there's always been that sort of urge in media or the necessity in media to balance a story and make sure you get multiple perspectives on the things that are, especially if they're controversial or political in nature. But I see that there's a struggle now often between how do you balance coverage in an age like we're living in. Often in the past, it was when I was starting out in newspapers, it was like, okay, you get a quote from one campaign and they say one thing, then you go to the other campaign and you get a response or a balancing quote, and you put both of them in there and get them the same column space, and that's how you balance a story. It's gotten a lot more complicated, I think, because often I notice that at times one side or another may be way more factual and dealing with real world situations where the other is being, I would argue, disingenuous. How do you as a reporter, or how should we as reporters learn how to cover that in a way that holds to the ideas of fairness, but also fact checks sources or quotes from public officials when they're blatantly inaccurate or manipulated?
I guess what's important to think about is it's always important to be, I guess one thing that I've been thinking about is recognizing that, information has become so siloed in the United States and the way that we, lots of people, populations and the way that lots of groups in this country receive information is very polarized and very siloed. And people are, not necessarily operating with the same set of what they believe to be the facts. So I think it's maybe, but I don't really know necessarily um, if I have like a silver bullet answer on like how that should inform our reporting, other than it's important as, at least in my experience, I think it's important to, what I try to do is recognize that, not everyone in the United States right now is operating on the same kind of plane of facts, and to just be cognizant of that in your reporting and hopefully, address that in some way.
Yeah, try to be as accommodating to that fact. And I mean, people are meet them where they're at is part of it sounds like what you're saying, because people are the products of whatever information they're taking in, and those diets are dictated by social media, which is another issue facing a lot of journalists, how to operate in a sphere when people are so inundated with information coming from social media and elsewhere. It seems to be getting increasingly complicated. One of the things that people often who are sort of on Donald Trump's side in terms of Voice of America, they would say things that like Voice of America was a propaganda network for the federal government. How do you respond to that? I mean, obviously you were reporting the news and you weren't taking your orders from the federal government, but just to put that to bed, how do you respond?
Absolutely. What I guess I can speak from my personal experience is that we took our responsibility to report balanced news very, very seriously. Every news story would go through multiple rounds of edits plus an additional balance edit that was just looking at, is this story balanced, representative of different views on this issue's fairly representing those views on this issue. So I mean, I did hundreds of stories during my time at VOA, and so I saw firsthand how seriously the journalists there and obviously myself as well took balanced reporting and fair reporting.
Now, you mentioned that there was a large number of people who were kind of put out of work by the closure of Voice of America. Where does that stand? I know that there's been legal challenges against the closure. Is there a possibility that you could go back to work, that all this could be undone? Are you holding on to that or moving on? I mean, it must be a hard, road to go down, not knowing what the future holds.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been about 2 months now, since about all 1,300 or so staffers at VOA were placed on administrative leave, including me. Um, and there are two kind of different, so I'm classified as a contractor. There are about 500 people classified as contractors at VOA. And some of us have started to receive termination notices. So I'm set to be terminated on May 23rd. Um, and other people will remain on administrative leave, as there are multiple lawsuits ongoing that are contesting the Trump administration's actions in terms of Voice of America. Um, but I think it's really important also to highlight, that, like, yes, I'm in an unfortunate position of about to be terminated in a little less than 2 weeks, but at the same time, there are other journalists, other colleagues of mine who are in much more vulnerable situations, at VOA and at our sister outlets like Radio Free Asia, who are at risk of, if they lose their jobs, at risk of losing their visas in the United States and could be forced to return to countries whose governments have records of imprisoning journalists who are critical of the government, including countries like Vietnam and Russia and others. And then another, facet of that is we have 11 journalists now across Voice of America, Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia, who are imprisoned around the world in different countries for doing their jobs. So there's a really big question of what's going to happen to these journalists if these news outlets are shuttered, or if they're really kneecapped to the point that they can't really, do what they were, created to do. Who will advocate for them, and who will, if they're imprisoned for doing their job at Voice of America or at Radio
Yeah.
Free Europe, if that news outlet is essentially shuttered, who's going to advocate for them is a really big issue.
Yeah. Wow, that's terrible. What would you point to during your time at Voice of America as like the most important thing that you felt like you covered? And what did you learn as a young journalist working abroad like that and covering, despotic regimes and all of that? It must have been a huge educational experience.
Absolutely. Two main things come to mind. I led our coverage on the imprisonments of journalists Evan Gershkovich and Alsu Kurmasheva when they were wrongfully imprisoned in Russia. So I led our coverage on those cases from when both of them were imprisoned, developments throughout their imprisonment, and their ultimate release in a prisoner swap last August. That was, obviously a huge story that I'm grateful that I was able to tell. There aren't that many happy endings when it comes to press freedom stories, and there was a happy ending when they were released. But I did. My colleagues and I worked on a mini documentary that documented the fight to secure Alsu Kurmasheva's release. She's a colleague of mine at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, based in Prague, and really documenting how so much of the burden when an American journalist is wrongfully imprisoned abroad falls on the family to advocate for them and continue to remind the U.S. government to try and secure their release. And there's this feeling that different people in those unfortunate positions told me that there's a fear that if they don't continue to advocate and remind the U.S. government about their loved one, that they'll be forgotten. So that's one. And then another story that I covered a lot was that of exiled media in a few different ways. But so many journalists around the world have been forced to flee their home countries like Russia and China to continue operating and doing their journalism outside of the country. They sacrifice so much to continue doing their work, their friends, their families, their houses, their culture, their language, all to continue doing their work outside of their home country, thousands of miles away in unfamiliar places. And oftentimes when they're in those places, they still aren't necessarily safe because, like Russia and China, for instance, are among the top perpetrators of transnational repression, which means they regularly reach across their borders to continue to target these journalists through various means, including surveillance, physical threats, online harassment, in an effort to intimidate them into silence.
Were you ever personally afraid of repercussions through your reporting?
Sometimes, but always, top of mind is making sure that my sources are safe and taking whatever, necessary precautions I have to protect them.
Thank you for your courage and your hard work. It's an inspiring story, and I appreciate the time you took to talk with us. I think our viewers will enjoy your story.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That's it for this week. As ever, thanks for watching. Stay tuned, stay informed.